All right. Thanks for joining us again as we continue our discussion through the Daily Bible. It's Todd Cateau, Gary Calvert. Gary, glad to have you with us again. And we're continuing in the Old Testament, 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 1. And then we're just going to edge into 2 Kings this week. And so turn over to Gary and we'll just go through it.
Basically, as we left off last week, we just had Solomon dying, and we have the kingdom being split into two king/kingdoms: the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. And so, in this week, we're going to walk through roughly 85 years of various kings in both kingdoms.
So, this is one of the tricky parts about reading this section of the Bible is we alternate between the kings of the north and the kings of the south.
Exactly. And so consequently, I'm going to try to stress the word try to outline everything involving with the kingdom of Israel with little snippets here and there from the kingdom of Judah. And then we'll do the kingdom of Judah.
Okay.
And so we might be a little bit out of order on the chapters at times, but because as Todd says, it's kind of interlaced because you're going to have the Israel and Judah fighting each other at different times, and at other times they're going to be allies
fighting someone else,
fighting somebody else,
and
so hopefully it'll be all come together for us as we do this, and then ultimately we're going to talk about Elijah and his at the end of this section, and then obviously we'll transition on to Acts, and we'll do the New Testament.
So we're introduced to the great prophet Elijah in this section, which is a lot of interesting stories. I found it helpful. I found this little chart of the kings of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, names, the years that they reigned, and then kind of a thumbs up or a thumbs down or kind of in the middle.
Mostly down
in the northern kingdom. They're all thumbs down, and of course that kingdom is going to be destroyed long before the southern kingdom.
Exactly.
So if you can find this online, I just googled the kings of Judah and Israel.
That's exactly what I did.
So pop one of those up, and like I said, I would go back and I would just cross-reference that as well. All right, so we're going to start with the northern kingdom kings.
Correct.
All right, so let's go.
So we're talking about Israel. First off, we have Jeroboam the first. Jeroboam comes to the kingdom. He was actually a servant before he became king, and so consequently, he didn't have the. You're going to see in the kingdom of Israel, you don't have the lineage necessarily that you see in the kingdom of Judah, where somebody from the line of David is always on the throne.
Right.
So he was a servant, and as Todd indicated, he gets the
thumbs down. In fact, you'll read other kings that are bad. You're just like Jeroboam. Yeah. So he becomes like the standard bearer for all the bad kings to come.
Exactly. Yeah. You'll be able to find, I got a reference here. He's in 1 Kings chapter 12 through 14. You'll see a lot of references there. So just to there. A couple of different stories that I just wanted to bring up about Jeroboam. In chapter 14, Jeroboam has a son named Abijah, or something very similar, who gets sick. And Jeroboam says, "Hey, wifey, I need you to run over to the prophet and give him some gifts. But then, more importantly, find out if Abijah is going to be okay, if he's going to recover."
Yeah.
So. The thing about it, she gets all disguised up because they don't want to know that she's the king's wife, but unfortunately for her, they knew it was her.
Yeah, the prophet. It's hard to pull the wool over the eyes of a prophet. Yeah.
When you have God telling you what's going on here, it kind of is difficult to pull the wool over. Yeah. But in a nutshell, she goes down there and he tells her, "I got some bad news for you. Jeroboam is an evil king. He's worshiping idols. He's not doing what God wants him to do. And when you get back, when you step foot back into your town, your son's going to die."
Right.
Sure enough,
she goes back home.
She goes back, and just like the prophet says, boom, he drops dead.
Yeah.
And so Jeroboam is a little upset with the whole issue there, but as as Todd indicated, he was a very evil king, and like he's referenced several times, similar to his grandfather, similar to his whatever, just as bad as Jeroboam.
Right.
And so another thing that I wanted to point out in this is God specifically tells Jeroboam and Rehoboam, Rehoboam being the king of Judah,
Right.
do not fight each other. But they're constantly fighting each other. They have a battle or two. And later on, you'll still see more and more interaction. But again, like we indicated, sometimes they were allies.
Right.
When it was convenient for them.
Right. There are several other nations that are mentioned several times: Moab, Edom,
Adamite.
Yeah. Again, I don't have my map with me, but that's another map.
Yeah.
Map of the time of Elijah.
The neighbors of Israel.
Right.
Israel, the country Israel proper.
Right.
We then,
and even Egypt gets involved in this.
Egypt comes down and borrows a thing or two.
Yeah. Now this is a little trivia here in chapter 14, verse 25. This is the northern kingdom. Sorry about that. But in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem, carried off all the treasures of the temple. I just recently watched Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
And that's what
it's mentioned. Shishak is mentioned as Indiana Jones is trying to explain what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. So,
and if Hollywood says it's true, it's got to be true.
That's got to be true. Yeah.
Anyway.
So I just couldn't help resist mentioning that.
The next king, very little is said about him. It's King Nadab. He reigned for 2 years. He too was a thumbs down sort of guy. He was actually assassinated. He was actually assassinated, and I didn't write down who. Oh, it was King Baasha, the next person.
Next guy.
Did a little house cleaning, shall we say.
Okay.
And so as we, King Baasha, that's B as in Bravo, Baasha, he reigned for 24 years, and he too was a very evil person. He basically was tasked with cleaning the whole house of Jeroboam, just like Ahijah had prophesied that would happen because of the wickedness of Jeroboam. Baasha and Asa being the king of Judah,
a good king,
are at war. Baasha takes over a city called Ramah and builds a big fort there, and ultimately the two sides end up agreeing to get away from each other.
Okay.
And Baasha withdraws from Ramah, and Asa goes through and takes apart everything that he'd built and takes it over and builds another city with it, which is just a kind of interesting thing, a little factoid, but he just built a whole new city. In chapter 16, it was prophesied that Baasha, being just as bad as his dad, Nadab, his posterity is going to die and get eaten by dogs and birds. Yeah. Again, sorry for the graphicness of it, but you're going to see that later on in the reading. It actually happens over and over again.
Yeah, there's
Jezebel, it happens regarding Ahab and Jezebel. Yeah. But a lot of that is prophesied, and the prophecy comes to fruition time and time again. We then head to Elah, E-L-A-H, 2 years, again, an evil person. He was also assassinated by Zimri, which Zimri was a captain of the army. And so Elah was actually the son of Baasha. So, and that's in 1 Kings chapter 16. Zimri, who had killed Elah, he only reigned for 7 days.
7 days.
Wow. He was in for a short reign. What ended up happening is everybody heard about what he did, the purge that he did, and they said, oh, it's time for him to go. After Zimri kills all of Elah's and Baasha's family, even killed their friends, just to make sure no uprising comes up.
Right.
But then ultimately he's only on the throne for 7 days. And again, he's very evil as well.
Yeah, thumbs down.
We then, Omri is the one that actually suicide, because Omri has Zimri all surrounded, and Zimri knows what's about to happen to him, and so he sets the place on fire with himself into it. And so it's a very short reign for King Zimri. Omri was on the throne for 12 years.
12 years.
An interesting caveat, he was the worst of all the previous kings. That's
bad.
That's bad. And keeping in mind, Jeroboam was multiply, either this week or next week in the reading, was referenced as being as bad as Jeroboam. And so we know this Omri had to be a bad guy. But then we head to Ahab.
Right, he's going to outdo him.
Ahab was there for 22 years. And again, it mentions he was worse than Omri. So it's a kind of a one-upsmanship.
Right.
Who can be the most evil king?
Yeah.
But Omri, and this is in 1 Kings chapter 17, Ahab had some help, shall we say. He was married to Jezebel.
Jezebel was urging him on in his evil ways. Yeah, for sure.
And so he was warned against that she would distract him, and you'd be worshiping her gods. And we're going to find that again came to fruition as well. One quick story regarding Ahab, and it's regarding Elijah. Elijah tells Ahab that in the name of God, it's going to rain, not going to rain until I tell it to. And Ahab gets a little upset because it's a little parched out there. And so, but Elijah flees because he's afraid of Ahab and what's Ahab going to do. So God makes an arrangement, and this is kind of a reference back to Egypt, the fleeing from Egypt. Ravens are going to provide not manna,
some bread
for him. Sorry, bread for him, and there's going to be pools of water, a stream that he can drink.
No water anywhere else, but it's going to be where he
water
is
for him. And ultimately, he survives, but he ends up going to the town in Zarephath, and he's directed that there's a widow that's going to be there to take care of him. And so he has nothing. He goes to town and he says, "Hey, why don't you make me a meal?" And she says, "Hey, I've got enough for myself and my son for one last meal, because we are starving.
We're through."
And Elijah says, "Hey, God will take care of you if you feed me your meal." My words, not the actual biblical text. But ultimately, she says, "Okay, I'll feed you the meal. Everything's fine." She's got the food that she needs. Her son has the food he needs. But unfortunately, the son gets sick one day and ends up dying. And the woman wonders if God hadn't sent Elijah to punish her in some way. So ultimately, Elijah takes the son and carries him up the stairs to the room where he was staying, and prays to God, and the boy's soul is restored, and he comes back alive. And obviously, the young lady then says, "God's got it. You're a man of God." And so consequently, everything is fine, and we all live happily ever after.
Reading through that before you go on, Elijah really hadn't done anything at this point. And as I was reading this again this time, I thought this must have been a real faith-building experience for the prophet. He goes out, God provides for him. He meets this widow. They're provided for with this miraculous flower that keeps appearing, and then the child dies, and Elijah's able to bring him back to life. So in a way, it seems like God is kind of charging up Elijah's battery right now at the beginning of his ministry in order to be faithful and really confront the evil that Ahab is going to bring to the people. And so this is kind of Elijah's basic training, or I don't know. This must have been an episode or episodes that he looked back on, and he said, "Yeah, I know the Lord's with me."
He draws strength from it.
Yeah.
So 3 years pass with the big famine going on in the land, and God tells Elijah it's time to go face Ahab. And Ahab's getting desperate because he needs water. He calls one of his governors to the house by the name of Obadiah.
Not the prophet Obadiah we read about. This is way before that time.
Exactly. But Elijah says, "Whoa, Obadiah
is like,
this isn't a good situation I'm getting put in because if I go find Elijah, the Holy Spirit is going to move Elijah, and then I'm going to be the one that says, okay, you told me he was here. He's not here."
Yeah.
Converse.
So Ahab has this grudge against Elijah, and it seems like he's been searching for him, hasn't been able to find him, and so Obadiah rightfully is
a little
scared.
wary.
Well, yeah, wary of going to tell the king that Elijah's there, and especially if he runs off. But Elijah reassures him, and
so then he goes back and tells Ahab, "Hey, he's over here. Let's go. Let's go talk to him." And
I love the introduction. Ahab says to Elijah, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?"
Yes, you're the ones. You are the one that's bringing all this down on Israel.
Yeah.
And Elijah kind of spins it back on him, saying, "No, Ahab, it's you.
It's you
that's bringing the bad things on Elijah because you're worshiping the idol. You're worshiping Baal."
Yeah.
And again, referencing Jezebel as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so ultimately, Elijah has a great plan. He's like,
"Let's have a showdown.
Let's have the showdown at high noon. You get all your prophets from Baal, and y'all build an altar, and you slaughter a calf or an oxen, and you put them on there, and then you call down to your God for the fire to consume it."
Right. See what happens.
And
it looks like there's quite a crowd here. I mean, there are how many hundreds?
Roughly 1,000.
All right. So there's
450 prophets and 400 others that eat at Jezebel's table.
Right. Elijah's really going out on a limb here.
Wait, and it's 450 to 1.
Yeah, that's right.
And so so they call down for Baal to consume their sacrifice. Nothing happens.
Yeah.
They call again. They get louder. They cut themselves. Still nothing happens.
Yeah.
And then basically Elijah says, "Okay, stand back, boys."
Well, he talks a little trash at first. "Well, where's your God? Is he out on vacation? Is he tired?"
He's a little sarcastic.
He is, yeah.
And so
shows a lot of confidence.
Yeah. Well, because he knew God was going to take care of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So much so that he builds the altar.
Yeah.
He slaughters the oxen. He puts the wood up there.
Yeah.
He says, "Hey, give me 4 large jugs of water and fill it up."
Yeah.
Not once, not twice, but 3 times.
3 times. Yeah.
He fills it up. He then prays to God and asks him to bring down the fire. Poof. The fire comes down.
Right.
Everything is consumed. The rocks, the oxen, the wood, the water, everything is consumed.
Right.
At that point in time, the prophets or the people that worship Baal knew the gig is up. And so that the Lord is God and the Lord is God forever.
Right.
So Elijah has all the prophets of Baal seized. So let's call it 1,000 people, give or take 50 or so. And he takes them down to the brook of Kishon and has them killed.
Yeah.
So problem solved as far as the prophets of Baal are concerned.
Right. At least for the time being. Yeah.
Yeah. At least for the time being, because we're going to circle back around to them here in a little bit.
Yeah. Let me say something about that Obadiah, who's the messenger. Obadiah, there's also a little note that he's been kind of hiding out some of the prophets of the Lord. And so Elijah is not all by himself. He sometimes makes that claim, but there are some other people that are staying faithful to the Lord.
Other pockets of people.
Right. So Obadiah kind of has a little refuge going on.
Elijah then tells Ahab, says, "Go home, eat up and drink, because it looks like rain."
Yeah.
Again, a little sarcasm that my God controls everything that's going to happen in your life. And so consequently, Elijah and his servant are hanging out on Mount Carmel praying. And he says to his servant, "Hey, go over and look at the sea and see if there's any clouds over there."
Yeah. Give me a weather forecast.
Give me a weather report.
Yeah.
They didn't dial up their app like
That's
we
right.
can. Yeah. Ultimately, he sends him over there 7 times to check the weather.
Yeah.
And on the 7th time, he finally sees a cloud.
There's a little bit of a cloud out there.
And Elijah says,
"Good enough for me.
Good enough. We got to go. We need to go see Ahab." And so he travels to Jezreel and gets there before Ahab actually arrives there. And when Ahab tells Jezebel about skipping it back a little, sorry, a huge rainstorm hits as Ahab arrives there at thing.
And then we have that great scene of Elijah just tucking his cloak and his belt and running
out
with almost like supernatural speed.
So
and endurance.
So then in chapter 19, we see Ahab telling Jezebel the bad news about
happy with this.
The relationship on the mountain and that. And so he says, all your prophets are dead. And Jezebel says, I'm going to get him before the sun goes down.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, she ends up getting her just dues in a little bit later. But so Elijah again goes into hiding to get away from Jezebel. And so he's under a tree, and the Lord basically says, what are you doing here under the tree? Mm-hmm. He falls asleep because he says, I think it's time for me to go.
Yeah.
Ultimately go. Yeah. And ultimately God says, no, I still got a couple of things I need you to do.
Elijah's depressed. I mean, he's down. Yeah.
So ultimately an angel comes to wake him up a second time, and he tells him, you better eat something because you're about to go on a major trip. You're going to be traveling, and you're going to need to eat and be prepared. So Elijah wakes up and eats again. That was in a vision. And so he heads off to Mount Sinai. It's also known as Horeb, which we've heard about Mount Sinai before. Yeah. So he can't eat anything for 40 days and 40 nights. Again, another reference to 40-40, which we know that Noah's reigning on the ark. So peculiarity, don't know. But it's just something very interesting. Finally, he arrives in Horeb, and once again, he finds a cave and goes to sleep. And that's when the Lord asks, well, what are you doing here, Elijah? Well, I've been really loyal to you, but the Israelites are breaking your covenants and tearing down your altars and killing your prophets. Again, like Todd said, he's just really in a down, in a bad place. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me, so I'm hiding out. And so the Lord tells Elijah, go stand on the mountain because I'm going to come up there. So then there's a mighty rush of wind, but God wasn't with that mighty rush of wind. Then there was an earthquake. God wasn't with the earthquake. Then there was silence. And that's when Elijah wrapped his face with his cloak and went out and to the mouth of the cave, and he hears a voice ask, what are you doing here? Again, he answers with the same. And then the Lord tells him to go back to the wilderness of Damascus because I have a mission for you. I need you to anoint Hazael as king of Syria, again, a neighbor, Jehu as the king of Israel, and Elisha to be your prophet, to be the prophet.
The first mention of his successor.
Yes. So with that, the Lord says, whoever escapes Hazael's sword will be killed by Jehu. There's a plan involved. And then whomever escapes from Jehu will be killed by Elisha. So again, there's still about 7,000 people left in Israel that don't worship Baal. Kind of like Todd was saying, there was pockets around. So Elijah goes back, and on his way, he passes Elisha's farm. And this is chapter 19. Elijah puts a cloak around Elisha, and that signifies the kind of the passing of the torch, if you will. And Elisha understands the symbolism, and he's called to go with Elijah and serve God for the rest of his days. So Elisha sacrifices oxen and passes it out to the town people, and off to follow Elijah he goes.
Right. So he's going to be a disciple of Elijah.
So then that brings us to chapter 20. Once again, Ahab is being sieged at the capital of Samaria, and Ben-Hadad sends a messenger to tell Ahab, here, you need to surrender. We've got you, King's X. We need you to give me all your silver and all your gold, your prettiest wives and your children, and we'll leave you alone. Ahab gathers his elders together again, consults with them, and the elders say, that's what you need to do. But Ahab says, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Tell them we're not going to do it. This obviously infuriates Ben-Hadad.
Right.
And so he launches the attack on the city. But an unknown prophet comes to Ahab and tells him the Lord is going to help you win this battle.
Mm-hmm.
So Ahab gathers 232 leaders, and they're to lead his army of 7,000. And they, in turn, attack Ben-Hadad's people while they're in a drunken stupor.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ahab leaves no prisoners, except for Ben-Hadad escapes. But the prophets then turn around and warn Ahab, you hadn't seen the last of Ben-Hadad. He's going to come back in the spring and want to fight you again. And sure enough, Ben-Hadad says the only reason we lost was because their God was the hills God.
Right.
We need to fight them on the plains.
Yeah.
If we fight them on the plains, we can beat them.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for Ben-Hadad,
Change of venue
doesn't
help.
The home and road didn't work out for him. So once again, God tells Ahab that as long as you prove to God that that I am your God, then I'll take care of you. The Israelites kill 100,000 soldiers of Ben-Hadad in a single day, and the Syrians have to flee to a city for a place of refuge. And while they're doing that, the city wall falls on them, and 27,000 people are crushed by the city wall. So Ben-Hadad then sees the ultimate handwriting on the wall and says, I'm going to hide in the city. And his advisors say, hey, you just need to surrender. And so an emissary goes to Ahab and says, hey, will you accept our surrender? And Ahab's like, yeah, he's my brother. I'll take care of him. And so they settle their differences and make some treaties. However, the Lord wanted Ahab to kill Ben-Hadad. So Ahab didn't consult the Lord with what to do.
So another treaty made without
the blessing of God.
Right.
So God sets up a little bit of a lesson for him.
Yeah.
He has a person, in essence,
another prophet.
Another prophet, in essence, feign an injury.
Right.
I mean, he was actually injured, but he was injured because he said, hit me in the eye.
Yeah.
And so he has a bandage over his eye, and Ahab doesn't recognize him when he's coming back. And the prophet tells him a story. He says, I've been fighting in the battle. I was told to guard this person, but this person, while I was distracted because of the battle, got away. And now I'm having to pay a talent of silver, which that's about 75 pounds of silver. And so consequently, what can you do for me, King Ahab? And but then the prophet takes the patch off his eye, and Ahab realizes, hey, I know you. And the prophet says, you just sealed your own fate, because it was you that I was playing like I was. You had Ben-Hadad in your clutches, and you let him go. And so consequently, we're going to see some repercussions for Ahab because of that.
Interesting that God is still, to some degree, blessing King Ahab, gives him this victory. And throughout this reading, there's this feeling that I picked up that God still has this affection, even for this northern kingdom. And on the basis of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even though these people are wicked, every once in a while, God says, I'm going to give you another chance. I'm going to provide this victory for you. And even someone as evil as King Ahab benefits from the goodness and the mercy and the grace of God. Unfortunately, you would think at this point that Ahab would say, thank you, God. You're my provider. You have delivered me. But then he just falls back into his wicked ways. And chapter 21, we have that story of Naboth's vineyard.
And I think a lot of that is he kept relying upon Jezebel and things she was telling him to do. He kept leading him down the primrose path. And so in this particular case about the vineyard of Naboth, Ahab wants to provide a reasonable amount of money for the vineyard, but again, Jezebel has her own plan. she ends up saying
So he
that,
comes back to Jezebel. He wanted the place.
Yeah.
You know, he's had it in the family for a long time, and so I'm just going to leave him alone. Jezebel, now you be a king.
Yeah.
You know, you want it, you take it.
You got it.
Yeah. And so she arranges to make sure that that this Naboth is going to be killed. So
Right.
a conspiracy comes out.
Ultimately, she has people tell lies about that
She
he
hires a couple of
blasphemed.
hitmen,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah.
And so consequently, he ends up going before the people and ends up being killed
Yeah. Stoned.
and stoned. And then lo and behold, Ahab gets to own the vineyard.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
Jezebel pulled some strings.
Pulled some strings, but it still made God unhappy. Again,
Yeah.
the whole cycle just keeps coming back
Right.
on him more and more. So God sends Elijah to tell Ahab that he's going to die. And again, dogs will lick up your blood at the same place that they licked Naboth's blood.
Mhm.
Again, some foreshadowing
Mhm.
of the situation.
And I don't know if that's in this week's reading or next week's reading, but that's exactly what happens.
Exactly.
Right.
So Elijah says, you keep bringing evil into your life because you've sinned and made Israel sin. You've allowed Jezebel to tempt you to worship idols, and now you're going to be sorry. Again, this kind of puts the fear of God in Ahab. So he starts to straighten up again just a bit and humbles himself before God. Because of this, God says, hey, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to wipe out your family until after you die.
Right. Right.
Again,
The patience of God is really remarkable in these with this northern kingdom. A lot of
again,
times, God is portrayed as a God who's just, I'm going to destroy this nation. And it certainly is a terrible destruction that's coming. But He is so patient with this nation that that really needs to be seen. That God is giving them every chance to come back to Him.
over and over again.
Yeah.
And keeping in mind, all these kings have had the thumbs down.
Right. Right.
I mean, it's a
right.
unanimous decision.
Yeah.
And so consequently, God has an affection for His global people of Israel,
Yeah.
not the kingdom of Israel, not as much as the kingdom of David, i.e. Judah. So, so chapter 22, we have a little piece. But King Jehoshaphat, king of Judah at that time, comes to visit Ahab. And while he's there, Ahab has a proposition for him. Syria has conquered a city called Ramoth Gilead, and that really belongs to us. And so, hey, how about us getting together and going over and getting what's rightfully ours? And so a messenger goes and gets Micah because Jehoshaphat wants to know what God thinks about all this. And again, Jehoshaphat being from Judah is more on the side of
Jehoshaphat,
thumbs up.
Yeah.
So the messenger arrives at Micaiah's house and tells him, look, all these other prophets have said it's good to go attack Syria.
Yeah.
Hey, we really need you to say it's okay too.
Right.
And Micaiah's like, I'm going to say what God tells me to say, regardless of whether that's going to make Ahab happy or not.
Right.
But then again, in a little twist of sarcasm, when he gets there, he does say, hey, it's good to go, Ahab. But Ahab kind of sees through his sarcasm a little, and then Micah tells him the real truth. I saw your army scattered like a sheep with no shepherd. The Lord wants you to go to battle. He puts a lying spirit in all these other prophets that said it's okay. But Ahab, just as I've told you, he only prophesies bad. Oh, sorry, my bad. Ahab says, see, I told you, Micah only says never gives good news.
Yeah.
But Micaiah is actually just giving him what God says, not what King Ahab wants to hear. So ultimately, Ahab condemns Micaiah to prison and says, hey, when I return from this battle victorious, you will stay in prison. But Micaiah says, if you come back from this battle, then I'm not a prophet. Because he's like, what I said is going to happen.
Yeah.
And sure enough, Ahab and Jehoshaphat don't listen. They head off to battle in Ramoth Gilead. And the two, again, Ahab comes up with another scheme. Hey, King Jehoshaphat, dress in your royal garb so that
Yeah.
everybody sees you. And I'm going to dress up like just a normal G.I. Joe
Yeah.
so that they don't see me. And ultimately, that was the plan of the soldiers from Ramoth Gilead, was to go after the kings. But then they ended up saying, hey, that's not Ahab. That's not the one we want. And so then ultimately Ahab is hit with an arrow. The battle's still raging on around him. They're unable to evacuate him, and he ends up dying.
Yeah.
So that ends the life of King Ahab.
Yeah.
And Ahab's son Uzziah becomes the king. He reigns for 2 years. Again, he's evil, and this is in 1 Kings 22. But the knock on him is he continues to worship Baal.
Okay. Yep. Yep.
So,
All right. So we went to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 kings there in our reading this week. The kings of Israel.
correct.
All right.
We still have King Azariah. Again, he starts to reign, but he ends up falling through a floor and ends up being incapacitated. And again, Elijah comes and tells him, you're going to die. And so ultimately, the king knows that. Take a step back.
Yeah.
Go get a prophet. Tell me who it is. I mean, don't tell me who it is. Tell me what's going to happen to me. And Ahaz, when he hears the description of Elijah, he knows it's Elijah.
Yeah.
And Elijah says, I'm telling you what God says. So Ahaz sends 50 people up to get him. They wipe out the 50 people. A second group of 50 people comes up. He wipes out those second 50. A third group of 50 comes up, and the captain of the guard says, please don't kill us.
Yeah.
Please don't kill us.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to do my job. So Elijah spares him, and God tells Elijah to go along, promising to protect the captain. And they ultimately go to Ahaziah, and he repeats his prediction of death and chides them for their consultation with Beelzebub instead of God. Ultimately, Ahaziah dies, therefore fulfilling Elijah's prophecy. And then his brother Joram takes the throne. And we'll talk about Joram next week.
All right.
As far as the kings of Israel, that wraps up this week's.
Okay. All right.
Kings of Judah, not as much, because we've already painted some of the stories that crossed over between the two. Rehoboam is the first king of Judah. He too was evil. He was the son. He reigned for 17 years. And as Todd indicated earlier, and
There's the King Shishak.
Shishak,
reference there. Yeah.
the reference to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, he steals all the gold shields that Solomon had made, and ultimately Rehoboam's people had to use the bronze shields that were made for King David that we referenced last week in last week's reading. Abijah is there for 2 years. He too is evil. Asa, who we talked about with Baasha, reigned for 41 years, and he was a good king.
Yeah.
He too was a son, and that's in 1 Kings 15. And then Jehoshaphat was on the throne for 22 years. He was good, and that's in 1 Kings 22. During Jehoshaphat's reign in Judah, the people still continued to worship idols, though. He dies, and Jehoram takes his place next week in 2 Kings chapter 3 and beyond.
Okay. All right. So the reigns of the southern kingdom seem to be longer, and it's a family line that's maintained in Judah.
Yes.
So more stability, and every once in a while you've got a king that's at least pretty good. Yeah. All right.
So then we get to just an overview of Elijah, more or less Elijah's transfiguration into heaven,
right?
If you will.
Chariots of
the
fire
chariots
story.
of fire. We're talking about chapter 2 of 2 Kings. God's decided to bring Elijah to heaven in a whirlwind. He tells his future successor, Elisha, that God is sending him to Bethel. So Elisha says, "Oh, I'll go with you."
Yeah.
So they head to Bethel to meet a company of prophets, and those prophets are aware of what's happening as well. And so that he's going to be taking a guide. And Elisha insists on, let's keep going. I'm good with you.
With him to the very end.
So they meet in the prophets of Jericho, and the same sort of thing, who know what's ultimately happening. Finally, they come to the Jordan, where 50 men from the company of prophets, Elijah, like Moses, parts the river Jordan with his staff, and they get to the other side. Elisha asks for a double share of his spirit, and then a whirlwind comes down, and a chariot of fire with horses of fire appears, and Elisha ascends into heaven. And Elijah ascends into heaven. Elisha has his cloak around his shoulders, again signifying the passing of the torch,
Passing of the baton,
the baton to Elisha. He then takes the staff and parts the river Jordan so that they can go back across, and that's the way 2 Kings chapter 2 basically ends.
Okay.
So,
all right. Well, let's get to the New Testament, and that was a lot right there.
That was a mouthful.
That was a mouthful. Acts chapter 10 and going through chapter 14. So we see the expansion of the gospel to the Gentiles.
Yes.
In this particular chapter, and the message is spreading out as was predicted and as was commanded by Jesus. All right, Acts chapter 10.
The initial story in Acts chapter 10 is in Caesarea. There's a guy named Cornelius who's a Roman centurion, again, a Gentile. He observes the Jewish customs and prays every day, so he's a man of God. But one day when Cornelius was praying, an angel appeared to him, and they sent some men to Joppa to pick up Peter. He sends 2 of his slaves and a soldier right away. Meanwhile, the next day in Joppa, Peter is up praying on the roof when he gets hungry and he sees another vision. It's a cloth, a sheet with 4 corners on it, lowering a whole Noah's Ark
of unclean animals.
Right. And God tells him to eat. And Peter says, whoa, no, God. These are all unclean. I've followed the Jewish law. And God says, they're clean if I tell you they're clean. And so consequently,
Peter is preparing Peter's and the church's heart for the reception of the Gentiles into the kingdom.
So be careful what you say is unclean. So Peter, I've made this claim that Peter hears it 3 different times, and then all of a sudden the vision disappears. Then later on, Cornelius and Peter have a conversation, and they agree to go to Caesarea. When Peter's there, it's actually against the Jewish law for Jews to associate with Gentiles.
This is a big deal.
And that's when the light bulb comes on. That's what that vision was preparing me for. It's okay to associate if I tell you it's okay to associate. I put you in this position. So the light bulb comes on in Peter, and Cornelius tells Peter about his vision and asks Peter to tell him whatever it is that God needs to hear from him. Peter tells him that God doesn't play favor because he's the Lord of us all. So Peter then goes into a history lesson about Jesus, about him living, dying, and rising again. And the Holy Spirit falls on everyone who hears him, just in a quick nutshell.
It's almost like a mini day of Pentecost.
Yes, it's the Cliff Notes version. So ultimately, since the Gentiles are in that group and they want to be baptized, Peter goes ahead and baptizes them. Chapter 11, they're back in Judea. Word reaches the other apostles of the Jewish followers and the Jewish followers of Jesus that Peter's baptizing all these unclean Gentiles. And later, when Peter comes back into town, he has some explaining to do. And again, he explains his whole vision to them that God wants us to reach out to not only the Jews, but to the Gentiles, because some of the Jews weren't hearing the message, but the Gentiles were more open to the whole process. So then the disciples are doing a lot of preaching in the area. Again, as Todd indicated earlier, the spread of the church to the different areas in there, and primarily the Gentiles. So some groups want to go see about the Gentiles and how everything is going with them. Everything looked great, so Barnabas heads to Tarsus to go pick up Saul, where Saul was there, and bring him to Antioch.
Antioch kind of becomes a second central location, headquarters for Christianity. And this is going to be the launching point for the missionary journeys.
So the two stayed there for about a year, and they helped get a church up and running there in Antioch. And this is the first place that the term Christians is used. Right. Around the same time, a prophet by the name of Agabus comes to Antioch and talks about that there's going to be a terrible famine. The disciples decide it's up to them to make sure that fellow believers are taken care of. So they send supplies with Barnabas and Saul to make sure that they get through this famine. Again, that's a compelling reason for us to help our fellow Christians. It's just not about us. It's about those that we come in contact with.
Right. And this is also showing the unity that is existing between the non-Jewish and the Jewish Christians as well. Because in Antioch, my picture is it's not much more a Gentile population up there. So the Gentiles are reaching out to the Jewish people. Hey, we're in this together.
It's a bilateral relationship.
Yeah.
Chapter 12, King Herod decides to stir up a little bit of trouble. He has James, who's the brother of John, beheaded.
First martyr among the apostles.
Yes. And so he then arrests Peter, and all the followers are praying for Peter while he's in prison. And the prayers are answered in the form of an angel who appears and releases Peter from chains. At first, Peter just thinks, oh, I'm having another vision. This isn't really happening. But when the angel leads him outside the city gates, he's like, hey, this is really happening.
That's right. Pinch me.
So he rushes over to Mary's house, she's the mother of John Mark, and knocks on the door, and the maid Rhoda answers the door and says, it's Peter.
She doesn't open the door.
Closes in essence, closes the door and goes tells everybody, hey, Peter's at the door.
They can't believe it.
And they're like, oh, yeah, right.
It's just the spirit, or you're seeing things.
And so ultimately the door is open. They see Peter, and everybody is freaking out, if you will, because weren't you in prison, Peter? How'd you get out of prison? So forth and so on. And the next morning, the soldiers and Herod are obviously pretty confused themselves. And what happened? And Herod questions the prison guards, and he ultimately puts them to death because they think, obviously, that they're involved in some way with him escaping. Later, Herod is sitting in front of all his subjects, and they start chanting that he's a god, not just a man. Now it's God's turn to be angry with Herod.
Herod meets his doom.
And he is struck down and eaten by worms and dies. So chapter 13, as we wrap up this week's last part of the reading, in Antioch, there's a group of prophets and teachers just hanging around. God singles out Barnabas and Saul for these special duties. The pair head to Cyprus, where they run into false prophets by the name of Bar-Jesus. And when the Roman governor in the area asked Saul and Barnabas to chat with him about Jesus, Bar-Jesus tells the governor that they're just lying to him, that he's the one that really knows what's going on. Ultimately, Saul/Paul tells Bar-Jesus that he's terrible and that he's going to be blind for a while. And sure enough, Bar-Jesus is blinded. And the governor then believes, okay, Saul/Paul must be true, what he says. So ultimately, Paul and his friends leave Cyprus and head to Galatia, where they head straight for the synagogue, which is pretty much Paul's modus operandi. He comes to a town, goes to the synagogue. The religious officials there invite him to speak, and Paul, again, provides the history lesson of the Jewish people from King David. And from David, Paul claims comes Jesus, who is the fulfillment of everything God has promised to the Jewish people. But of course, some in Jerusalem, the folks down in Jerusalem, didn't realize this is what happened because they had him put to death on trumped up charges. Paul ends up telling them that they can free themselves if they put their faith in Jesus, even though the others in Jerusalem had been the one that killed him.
Mhm.
And unfortunately,
We're
those
all
that don't
guilty.
listen are going to end up dying. And as Paul and Barnabas are leaving, the people in the synagogues come over and ask them back for another week. And a lot of the people there are wanting to be baptized as well. And so a lot of people are baptized. Paul and Barnabas tell everyone the good news. And but since some are rejecting, God has asked them to move on to the Jewish people. He's asked them to move on to the Gentiles. So lots of, as I indicated, lots of Gentiles start following Jesus. And then the naysayers come just to cause problems, which causes Paul and Barnabas to have to start doing the leapfrog sort of thing. And they head to Iconium,
Mhm.
and then the same thing happens in Iconium, and ultimately they have to leave Iconium.
Mhm.
But that does not mean they have given up, because next week we're going to see the spreading of the gospel.
Right,
even
right.
more.
So the first this is known as the first missionary journey that has begun. Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark. Has John Mark already deserted them?
Not yet. That's
Not
the
yet.
beginning
Okay.
of
Whoops, sorry.
next week.
Give you a little preview. All
Yeah.
right. All right. Ignore
That's
that.
a teaser.
Ignore that. All right. All right, Gary. Thank you so very much.
A lot of
And,
information.
yeah.
So
yeah.
I encourage you to dig in deeper,
Yep.
and
Yeah.
we'll continue pushing on next week.
All right. We'll keep up the reading, and we'll be back next week with that reading.
Parts.
Hold on a second.